Okay, this is sort of a bonus lecture. It's not something that you necessarily need to worry about for the project that's coming up, but if you want to use the techniques in this bonus tutorial lecture, whatever it is, and you're feeling more advanced, certainly a couple of people, I've already looked at some of their submissions, their stuff on Unity Teams, and it looks like maybe some people are looking for some more advanced stuff to start biting their teeth into. So maybe you use this, maybe you don't. On this particular project, hopefully you do find it useful in the future projects. You definitely will. So what I want to talk about is structs and arrays. Okay, now next week we're going to be covering arrays as part of collections, lists and arrays in C Sharp. And there we're going to focus a little bit more on lists, but also kind of arrays in general. So this is going to be a quick and dirty introduction to them, and also to structures. Structures we don't generally use a lot. You've seen classes. So normally, in terms of our object-oriented programming, we tend to use classes much more in C Sharp and in Unity, and that's sort of the common thing. But structures are sort of the cousin of, or the uncle, great uncle. They certainly existed, I think, before classes kind of came along, but they are still very interesting. They're very useful for kind of quick and dirty small collections of things. If you want to create, sort of an object that you want to spin up real quick, and you might just want to use a little bit, and it's not something that really persists through the whole project, or it's just a couple of different fields you want to store together, and it's a little bit different, largely in that it's based on value as opposed to reference, which is some other concepts we're going to get to in the future when we talk about C Sharp. There's this notion of, are the things you're passing around that you're actually passing around their values, like the actual thing, or are you passing around and working with references to things? So it's like references are more like having a shortcut to something else, where you're actually pointing to some object that is a global thing, as opposed to value, that you pass around the actual values. So you sort of make copies and throw them around a little bit more. I wouldn't say carelessly, but it's they're more kind of quick and dirty to kind of throw around things by value than by reference. Okay, it's a little bit unusual. We'll get to that a little bit more in the future as well. So structures are a cool thing to know about, and can be very useful when you want to spin up an object real quick. Now, so why am I bringing this up now? Okay, so the main project here in our adventure game is largely based on this simple notion. If we go to our main scene in the adventure, let's save that last scene. We have the canvas, and we have our way of interacting with things. And in the scene, if we go to the main camera, we're using sort of two, maybe three, a couple of different objects to really interact with things as our kind of holders for our scripts, holders for our components, holders for certain values. Like specifically, the scene manager is the one that has our scripts on it. The key is sort of just a thing. It just has a transform. It just has a position in the world, and we're really just using that to see, okay, that's just a holder for an X and a Y value. All right. Ocean, that has an X and a Y value, and it also has this audio source on it. And last but not least is the player. And the player is where the player controller is, and eventually we'll get into audio listeners, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in the future. So there are a couple of things on the player. The player is kind of our most elaborate object, but ultimately this transform is also one of the most important things about the player. So it moves around in the world, and we know its position. So the ocean and the key are the two things that the player kind of interacts with. Well, what if we wanted to have a lot more of those? What if we wanted to interact with, say, maybe there were multiple keys, or maybe there was another bunch of things called zombies or werewolves or something like that that the player potentially could interact with. Okay, and there were multiple versions. Now, we don't want to necessarily, maybe we do have to create multiple versions of things in the scene here, because maybe we have, okay, I'm going to create an empty object, and we'll just call this one, say it's called zombie 1, and I just move zombie 1 to be, it's just at a position. This isn't a zombie that's actually moving around. I'm not going to get too fancy. Um, and then I'll copy that one. I'll paste, and I'll have zombie 2. Say here's zombie 2. And zombie 2 starts off in that same spot, but we'll move him around. So there's zombie 2. And just for good measure, I will copy, whoops, undo, copy and paste a zombie 3. Okay. And these, I would probably do this a little bit differently if I really was just like spawning random enemies. We're gonna get into that in the future as well. But the idea here is that imagine there are 3 zombies, and for some reason I position them specifically in the world. And for now, they don't have any attributes to them other than their position. Okay, just bear with me on that one. All right. So now I want the player to potentially interact with all these things, but imagine in my script, if I go to my player script, go to player, and inside my player controller, somehow, like right now, I have ocean and I have key. Would I have zombie 1, zombie 2, zombie 3? Maybe, right? But then inside my script here, when I was doing things like interacting with, say, I had my one chunk of my code that was okay, this chunk here was interacting with the room. This chunk here is interacting with the ocean thing, whatever. And this chunk here was interacting with the key, or checking for that interaction with the key. So I already have, distinct things for each one of those. And the question is, well, if I had 3 zombies, would I have another 3 of these? One for zombie 1, one for zombie 2, one for zombie 3. How would I deal with that? Okay. And the one suggestion I would have, perhaps this is a place to use a collection of zombies. And so say we had a collection, and we know we have 3 zombies in this scene. So I want to have an array of 3 zombies. Array is one type of collection that's pretty simple to use, right? So we'll start with that one. And we're going to just use it in our script. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to open the player controller. I'm going to kind of refer back and forth a little bit because I've set up a couple of things in my game manager script where I just sort of have various test code in there. So we'll kind of refer to that. And the other question is, or the other piece of it is, now imagine that here are my zombies. I have these 3 zombies. And what I want to have happen is I want to say, oh, okay, the player can encounter the zombies, or perhaps the zombies are active or deactive. There's some things about the zombies that I want to keep track of in my script. Now, I could add components to them, and they would have scripts and so on. That's more elaborate. But for now, stick with me. We'll try to be kind of, let's demonstrate the C# technique as opposed to how we would necessarily do it in Unity's game object component model. Okay, so we're going to talk about this in terms of the the C# side of things here. Okay, so let's jump back to the player controller. Now the idea, like I just mentioned, all right, so here we are in the player controller, and what we want to have happen is we want the player controller, the player may encounter one of these things, these zombies, these things, right? So I'm going to use a public struct. Okay, as I said, struct, kind of similar to a class, public struct, public class. Okay, and I'm going to call this a enemy, right? And I should capitalize that because classes and structs and things and enemy controller, that should start with that as well. But anyway, okay, it's an enemy. So this is a public struct enemy. So what does an enemy potentially have? How do I interact with it? Well, I need to know its position. So I have those game objects out there that I want to interact with. So let's, now this just like a class had elements and variables in it, the same thing goes with structs. So they're going to look very, very similar. So we're going to say, okay, within our struct, we're going to have a public game object, and we'll call it GO for game object. Okay, it should be actually lowercase GO, right? game object. And we also want to have some sort of value that's going to tell us encountered. Have we encountered it? Have we seen it? Have we interacted with it? All right. And maybe we have something else. Public bool active. Okay, is it active or not? Right? Did we kill it? Did we whatever, sort of thing. So imagine now, okay, so we have a game object, we have whether or not it's been encountered, and whether or not it's active. And we want to, whoops, and we want to keep track of those things. So this becomes a struct that I can then use. So now, inside my class, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to create an array of those. So I'll say public, and now I'm going to say, okay, enemy. This is what I want to create, and I'm going to create an array of those. This square brackets here, we talked about them before. So when there are collections, we use those. Public enemy, and we'll call this enemies. Okay, public enemy enemies equals, and I have to declare them, right? So we will say, let's make sure I get this right. I was kind of yeah, there we go. I'm cheating. We say new enemy, and I'm going to tell it how many. 4 or 3, because I only have 3. Okay. So public enemy, enemies, new enemy. So that gives me a space to put 3 enemies. And this is what is in each enemy. So up here now, I could do things. I could start to do things. I could say, okay, enemies, and then enemies, enemies 0 dot. Now wait a minute, it's not happening. The name enemies does not exist in the current context. enemies. What am I doing wrong here? Public enemy, enemies. Oh, I can't just use them in here. This is not code, right? To access actual code, enemies. There we go. I have to be inside a function here. Enemies 0 dot, and I can see, is it active? Is it encountered? Where's the game object? There it is. Dot game object. So I could say, I could initialize them. I could say, encountered equals false, for example. Right? So now I could refer to that enemy 0 as part of that. I worked on a game, Enemy 0. It was really a great game. Anyway, so now I have that accessible there, all right, or at least part of my player control. Now I go over here, and you'll notice if we go and we look at our player controller, now for some reason in our player controller, here's our player, you'll see that we can't actually see our enemies here. So we need to do a bit of decorating, a bit of additional decorating when it comes to structs and arrays in order to get them kind of on the board. So what we want to do, first off, we have to add this additional using system. Okay. There, whoops, what happened there? Using system, all right? And we are going to call this serializable. All right. So now this enemy here is potentially serializable. Okay. Now, once that happens, we're almost there. If we go to player, we see player script, we're not quite there. Oh, wait, we are. Yes, here we are. Okay. All right. So it is serializable, and we can see each one of these. All right, I wasn't sure if I was going to need to add serialized field, but since I declared it to be public already, so since it's public, we can see it. If I didn't want these to be public, then I would have had to declare them to be serialized fields as well, and that's a whole other thing. So look, I have these 3 places now, and I can go so far as to say, all right, let me grab zombie 1 and put zombie 1 into element 0. and put zombie 2 in there, and zombie 3 in there. Okay, and save that. And I could do things like say, okay, let me initialize active. All right, control save. Excuse me. So now I have these zombies that I can deal with, and if I come over in my code, I can just start working with my zombies. All right. So how do I work with an array of zombies? Now, as I move around, I might say, all right, you'll see in the case of each one of these objects down here, I was always specifically saying, okay, let's look at distance from transform.position to ocean.transform.position, right, for example, right? So now, if we wanted to do this for each of the zombies, as I said, for each of these zombies, right? So let's put this in here before we manage the door. After we bump into the walls, let's see if we are encountering any zombies. So for each, and this is where we like to do that, for each enemy, and we'll call this we'll call it E0 for enemy 0 in enemies, right? So that tells me, okay, one at a time I'm going to have E0 that I can refer to, and it's going to be from the enemies array. For each enemy, E0 in there, I can say if, and you'll see here, now, where's my typical, here's where I checked the distance between my current position and the ocean's position. So I could even, right in here, I could say, float my distance 1, transform.position E0 dot game object transform position. Okay. So now this distance is telling me, okay, that's how far I am from this particular zombie. And I can say if, you'll notice I don't have to say for each one of the zombies now. I can just refer to E0 and this will circle through them. So I would say if my distance 1 is less than, I don't know, 3, I would say, just for now, E0 dot encountered equals true. Cannot modify it because for each, why can't I do that? I thought I could do that. So, I'm not modifying. See, here's the problem. Okay, if I'm not careful when I do a for each, if I modify them, then potentially I could be kind of screwing up the enemies. So I'll do this a different way. I'll say, watch this. I'll say for enemy E0, or we'll iterate through that. Well, this is the normal way. For int I equals 0, I plus plus. No, I less than enemies dot length. Okay, I plus plus. And like I said, this is sort of, we assume that this is sort of a more advanced version. So now I say enemies I, and so on. And I can say enemies I encountered equals true. Now this is okay because I'm referencing them one by one, not using for each. For each is slightly finicky because it doesn't really want you to modify the results. So normally if you want to act on them but you don't necessarily modify them, I think that's what I've usually used for each. I just didn't exercise enough. Maybe we can come back to that one. Well, so anyway, All right. So now, as I potentially encounter zombies, I will be setting their encountered flag to true. Okay. By default, they are all set to 0, and um, let's just leave it at that. Let's just say, all right, let's move around, see if we bump into zombies, and I'm not going to do nothing too exciting, but what we can see here is we'll play the game, hopefully, and we will look at the player, and we'll see our zombies, and we haven't encountered any of them yet. But let's go ahead. We turn off the flashlight and move around.
No!
Ah, look at that. I encountered a zombie. And let's go this way. Am I getting close to a zombie? Maybe. There we go. We encountered the next zombie. And so on. So if I wanted to, just to make this a little bit clearer, let's do this. Let's say, okay, let's take an image, and I'm going to take this image and go ahead and drag it onto, let's see, can I add, it's going to be tricky to do it that way. I'm going to add a component here, and I'm going to add a sprite renderer. Whoops, not that. Remove component, add component, sprite renderer. And what did I do here? Oh, whoops. There. Sprite renderer. There. So I can see it. And just to make it look different, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna like flip it upside down just to say that's a zombie is a dead upside down thing. I don't know, whatever. All right, so now go back in, and in my game, where did I put it? I couldn't see it there. Interesting. Why don't I see my zombie? Sprite renderer, -10, RPI seal, simple none, color. I must have messed something up here. Reset that. Oh, okay. All these zombies are at a layer, which is not great. They are all at -10. They should all be at 0. There we go. All right, so now we see our nasty zombie. Turn off our flashlight because we don't need it. And let's, we can turn it on. And south, 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 south. Turn that off. Sneak up on it. So let's watch here. Encountered, encountered, encountered. Ah, all right, so that's zombie 1. Right, so then we could decide, okay, now let's turn it back on. Flashlight, there it is. We were in mode. So we could say, okay, what happens as a result of that encounter? Does it become active? Does it become disabled? Does it make a noise? Do we lose hit points? Do we score points? If we used our button, did something happen? And so on, right? So that's one way to kind of go ahead and use that. And the nice thing is, the main takeaway here is that we can implement once and iterate through that whole array of zombies or enemies in one chunk of code. We can even make this its own routine and so on, right? Yeah, that's the tip of the day there. So if you want to use arrays, and again, let me point out so we have here, say 3 zombies or 3 enemies, an array of 3 enemies, and we had a game object that we could then preload with the game objects here in the player. Okay. All right. So that's one way to avoid, like I said, one way to avoid having to have three sets of code. Now you could even do fancier things like say, okay, let me have an array of all of these game objects and then do different things based on their names, or perhaps do different things based on various fields and so on, right? So it's a way to basically kind of group certain similar things that have a similar structure. Like in this case, we have now a game object, but we have things that have been encountered and things that are active. So you could say, has the key been encountered yet? Okay, well maybe something has to happen differently based on it being encountered. Is it active? Doing something specific, right? And you can have all that function happen in this for loop here. All right, there you go. Hope you find that useful. And for those of you who want to looking, to make your little adventure game a little bit more exciting, perhaps have multiple enemies and without your code getting haywire, you can even make it scalable to the point where you just change one number, which is change this one number. This could become number of enemies, for example, and that would be you could dynamically change the number of enemies, perhaps, or not dynamically, but well, you could do it dynamically. We'll talk more next week. We'll get more into the actual collections and arrays and lists and so on. But for those of you who are working on this over the weekend and want to get take your game to the next level, this is for you.